Okay, I think we can begin. I want to cover a fair amount of ground today, so let's do that. We've been talking about social perception, and the analogy between social perception and non-social perception is just this. When we perceive an object, what we're trying to do is to figure out what it is, where it is, what it's doing. That is, what its physical states are. When we perceive a person, what we want to do is to find out what that person is, where that person is, and what it's doing, the psychological states of the object. So what we want to know is something about the individual's personality traits. Are they neurotic? Are they extroverted? Are they agreeable? Their emotions. Are they happy or they're sad? Their motives. Do they want something from you? Do they want to get away? And basically to classify their behaviors in terms of what they tell us about the individual's underlying mental states. So again, in the non-social domain, what we do is we extract information from the stimulus in order to answer those questions about what are the states of the object, the distal object that we're trying to perceive. Yes, we combine that stimulus information with information retrieved from memory, with knowledge and beliefs and expectations, but the basic information for perception is energy that radiates somehow from the distal stimulus and impinges on our sensory receptors in the eye, the ear, whatever. In the social domain, as you saw in the lecture last time, we often think about stimulus information in terms of a linguistic description, a verbal description of the individual. And we also think about the percept as somehow encoded linguistically as well. But it turns out that there's a lot more information available for social perception than just the verbal description, and sometimes you don't have a verbal description. You see somebody coming down the street, you haven't had a chance to speak to them yet. They're not holding a sign up that says, I'm a neurotic introvert or anything like that. What you have to do is to figure out what they are, what they're doing, what they want, what they feel from physical cues, namely their appearance and behavior. And there's a whole approach to social perception that is focused not on what we make of verbal descriptions of people, but rather what we make of their physical appearance. And this sometimes it has to do with this technical distinction in literature between impression formation, which is really pretty much what we do with verbal information, and person perception, which has to do pretty much with what we do with nonverbal information. So what I want to talk about today, finish up this set of lectures, is the problem of what physical features of the stimulus, that is, what physical features of a person give rise to the impressions that we have of that person's personality, impressions that are typically encoded in language. This is basically the question that underlies what's known as the ecological view of social perception, which is explicitly founded on the ecological view of perception in general that I talked about with you last time in terms of the work of, say, J.J. Gibson. And the people who are really involved in this, two people kind of led the way in this, a guy by the name of Reuben Barron at the University of Connecticut, and a woman by the name of Leslie MacArthur, now Leslie Zebrowitz, at Brandeis University. Like Gibson, MacArthur and Barron argued that all the information that we need for person perception is provided by the stimulus itself, that is, by the person. And that stimulus information doesn't come in form of a sign that people hold up over their heads or some kind of thought balloon or something, but rather physical information, information about physical appearance. And like Gibson, in the non-social domain, MacArthur and Barron argued that there was no need for any kind of so-called higher cognitive process in person perception. There was no need to rely on pre-existing knowledge or make any kinds of judgments or engage in high-level problem solving or anything like that, because all the information you needed for person perception was provided by the stimulus, itself. It's a radical position, but basically the idea here is they're trying to take this strong position to focus attention on the information that we get out of the physical stimulus. Yes, quick question. No, well, I'm probably trying to manage your impression of me. That's right. I'm trying to look competent and interested and all these things that I really am, and I want to make sure that you see that too. But you're forming an impression of me as a stimulus person, okay? Now, as I say, in the literature I talked about last time, those impressions are, the stimulus information on which those impressions are based is verbal descriptions. Solomon Asch's list of trait terms. Well, now we're not talking about trait terms anymore. We're talking about what I look like, and how I behave, how I walk across the stage, and all that kind of stuff. The physical features of the stimulus, and how we extract from the physical stimulus information about that person's psychological traits. Let me show you, I'll give you some examples in a minute. So, like what? There's Reuben Barron, there's Leslie Zebrowitz. Well, facial expressions. For one thing, the face is pretty obviously the primary social stimulus. It's pretty much the first thing we see when we come out of the womb. It's what we look at when we look at other people. We make eye contact with them or try to read their faces. But it's not just facial expressions. There's also bodily orientation, how people move, what their posture's like. There are vocal cues. Do they sound aggressive or do they sound gentle when they talk? There are things like interpersonal distance. Do they get up close and personal, or are they kind of standoffish? Do they make eye contact? Do they touch people when they're talking with them? What their physical appearance is like? Are they well-groomed? Are they unkempt? Do they dress up or dress down? I saw a faculty member walking across campus the other day in what looked to me like pajamas. And I just got to wonder what kind of impression that's supposed to give, not to criticize. And also the behavioral environment of the person. You go into somebody's apartment or their dorm room or whatever, you look around and you see from the posters on the wall and the tidiness of the desk, you try to get some impression of what that person is like. So this is the kind of physical information that Barron and MacArthur want to focus our attention on, not the kinds of verbal descriptions that Asch focused on. A leader in this area is Paul Ekman, longtime professor at University of California, San Francisco, also an adjunct professor here in the psych department at Berkeley, who has probably done more than anybody else to promote the idea of nonverbal communication of moods and affects and feelings and desires and all that, especially through facial expressions. Ekman himself is probably most famous in the wider world outside academics for his work on the detection of deception. He's been a long-time consultant to law enforcement agencies who are trying to develop ways of telling whether people are lying. And he basically argues that no matter what people say about their internal states, no matter what they try to communicate to you verbally, their true internal states, what they really want, what they really feel, is very often leaked through nonverbal cues, through behavior, and especially nonverbal cues that can be read off the face. The history of this goes back a long way, back to Charles Darwin in the 19th century, who argued that there were certain facial expressions of emotion that human beings had in common with other mammals, not just primates like chimpanzees or orangutans, but also dogs and cats and cows and whatever. And Ekman, like Darwin, argues that we have evolved in such a way that we express, almost as a reflex, we express these emotional states on our faces, and we've also evolved evolved in such a way that we can read these emotional expressions directly from other people's faces. Notice how Gibsonian this is. I don't think Ekman would actually say this, but it's true, because what Ekman is arguing, like Darwin, is that we are wired by evolution to pick up this information from people's faces. We look at them, we can read what their internal states are directly without making a lot of inferences or engage in problem solving or whatever. So again, from a Darwinian evolutionary point of view, there's really no point in expressing your emotion on your face unless you want that expression to be picked up by somebody else and read. So the very fact that we have these pre-wired mechanisms for emotional expression suggests that on the receiver end, we also have these pre-wired mechanisms for perception as well. So Ekman, to make a long story short, Ekman has argued, get to in a second, Ekman has argued that we come into the world by virtue of evolution with a small set of what he calls basic emotions, which are pre-wired. We have lots of other emotional states too, but those are acquired through histories of social learning. These are kind of built into us by evolution. It's a very short list, 6, 7, 8, depending on which version of Ekman's theory you read, and that these basic emotions can be read on people's faces directly. Joy, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, and disgust. Now, you had a question. Well, there's no point in expressing emotion on your face unless that's going to be read by somebody else. I can't see my face, right? So why would there be any reason for me to express my fear or anger or disgust or whatever? The reason for expressing it is so you can pick it up and you can respond accordingly. Okay, that's the idea. Okay, and in the same way as I have this built-in emotional expression mechanism, the implication is that you have this built-in emotion perception mechanism. Okay, you don't have to be taught this. Nobody sat you down about the same time they were teaching you to tie your shoes and said, well, you know, Sammy, when you see a face like this, it means the person's angry. We don't do that. We don't have to do that. It's all built into us. So, for example, I'll just run through these very quickly. Facial cues to happiness. These are stimuli from Ekman's own research. Happy people smile, and in those smiles, they typically show their teeth, okay, if you can. Some people have big lower lips or mustaches or something like that. You can't see those teeth. She doesn't, so she does. Okay, facial cues to happiness. Surprise, a widening of the eyes, usually an open mouth, kind of gaping. That's a universally recognized facial expression of surprise. We know it's universally recognized because Ekman and his colleagues, like Berkeley's own Bob Levinson, have done cross-cultural research, including research in non-literate cultures that have had very limited contact with the West, and they recognize these expressions as well. So there are some facial cues to surprise. Facial cues to sadness. Eyebrows are lowered, especially the outer corners. Your mouth is usually closed, certainly more closed than when you're happy, and you'll often push your lower lip out. That kind of expression, right? And that tells you that you're sad. Tells you that somebody's sad. Here are facial cues to fear. The eyebrows are raised, not lowered, raised. The eyes are opened wide as if in surprise. There may be some kind of avoidance reaction where the person leans his head back as if to get away from the stimulus. The chin's tucked in, the mouth open again. A very distinctive facial expression that indicates that the person is in a state of fear. And we have facial cues to disgust. The eyes narrow, the person is more or less squinting, the upper lip is raised, kind of a sneer, and the nostrils may flare out a little bit. Again, this is an expression of disgust that you'll see from one culture to the next, literate, non-literate, Western, Asian, native, whatever, you'll see this. And people will read, people from different cultures, if they see a face like this, and you say, what's this person experiencing? They'll say, this person's experiencing disgust. Okay, and finally, we've got anger here. Eyebrows are drawn down, the upper eyelid can be raised, press the lips together, kind of a stern face, pushing the lower lip up and contracting the jaw muscles so that you're kind of clenching your teeth. Facial cues to anger as well. And again, what Ekman and Levinson and lots of other people have done has been to show that when people are in these emotional states, they typically display these facial expressions, okay? And that when people display these facial expressions, other people typically perceive them as being in these corresponding emotional states. So there's a direct link between expression and perception. Ekman has developed the system into what's known as a facial action coding system, which is now taught to both researchers in emotion and also to, say, law enforcement officials to try to detect deception. I won't go through this in detail because it takes a while, as you can imagine. But basically what the facial action coding system involves is there's roughly about 66 different coding categories, and what you're doing is coding the actions of various muscles in the face. There are lots of muscles in the face, so there are these muscle action units, and these don't correspond exactly to muscles, but they correspond to muscle actions, okay? So there are many facial expressions of emotion that involve raising the inner part of the eyebrow, so there has to be an inner brow raiser, one or a combination of muscles that performs that particular activity. Similarly, there has to be a lip corner puller that gets you smiling, okay? There has to be a jaw clencher. We're not looking at specific muscles here, though we'll get to that in a second, but that's a muscle action, clenching the jaw. And then there are various action descriptors, sticking your tongue out, wiping your lip, rearing your head back, and so on. Here are some examples of the muscles of the head and the neck that perform these muscle action units. So here, for example, the orbicularis oris is moving the muscles above the lips. Here, the orbicularis oculi are moving the muscles above the eye, and so on. And you learn the system. As you learn the facial action coding system, you learn to recognize both these 66 different categories of facial action, and you also learn about the muscles that perform these actions. Okay, so for example, let's just go back to the facial expression of anger. As I said before, the eyebrows are drawn down and together. That is performed by a combination of 3 different muscles. It takes 3 muscles to do this. Raising the upper eyelid requires the action of an entirely different muscle. Pressing the lips together, yet another muscle. Pushing the lower lip up, yet another muscle, and so on. So when your grandmother told you that it takes 17 muscles to frown and only 2 muscles to smile, she was right. Okay, it really takes a lot of energy to be angry. Make life easier on yourself if you're happy all the time. But that's generally how this system works. There are recognizable facial actions, and then each of them is performed by one or more facial muscles acting alone or in combination. That's the general idea behind this. Okay. Here's a nice example of this. It turns out that when you look at people smiling, there are roughly 2 kinds of smiles. One is called the Duchenne smile, after a French investigator who discovered it. This is what you might call a genuine smile, an involuntary smile. When people are really happy, you make them really happy, they look just like this. and involves both the two major muscles, the zygomaticus major, which pulls in the cheeks, and the orbicularis oculi, which deals with the eyes. And then there's this smile. None of you are old enough, I think, to remember Pan American World Airways, but it's known as the Pan American smile. It's a smile that was actually taught to airline cabin attendants. It's a polite smile when you're getting toothpaste at the drugstore. This is the smile you put on for the clerk. It's the smile that she puts on for you too. It's more of a voluntary smile, and it basically involves just this one set of muscles, the zygomaticus, the major. So again, if you learn this system, you can read the difference between a genuine involuntary Duchenne smile and a polite voluntary Pan American smile. And once you pick up on this difference, you can begin to think about, well, is this person really happy? Does this person really like me? Or is this person just going through the motions? Okay. Notice what kinds of inferences you can make once you begin to pick up on this. Okay. So that's a general idea here. Time for quick questions about facial expressions of emotion. Yeah. You can control your facial expressions of emotion. That's right. And for example, actors are taught how to do this, okay, because they got to convey this emotion on the stage or the screen or whatever. And certainly you can exercise deliberate control over your emotional expressions. For example, in certain Asian cultures, you don't express a lot of emotion outside the family, right? So what people in that culture have learned is to kind of get control of this musculature, all right? Now, what Ekman would argue is that even when you're exercising deliberate voluntary control over your facial musculature, still there's going to be what he calls leakage of cues. That's going to, if you're good enough to pick up on it, it's going to reveal your true state. Ekman has made the largest production of this distinction between various kinds of smiles, okay, but also in his work on the detection of deception. He argues that when people are lying to you, they do certain kinds of things, right? They want to control the facial expression, but that if you're a trained observer, you can detect these very, very, very subtle cues. Remember, it's 66 coding categories, right? And you memorize all of these, as some people have the experience of being subjects in these kinds of experiments. And you can actually make some pretty interesting, pretty subtle discriminations among various kinds of judges. Okay, so facial expressions of emotion are one really clear example of an application of what I and Barron and MacArthur would argue is an essentially Gibsonian ecological perspective on social perception. The reason facial expressions work the way they do is that, by and large, we are geared to pick up automatically on certain information that coming off somebody's face that communicates to us, at least in terms of this half a dozen or so basic emotions, what the person's emotional state is. Yeah. Oh, you bet. You bet. In fact, there are some individuals, I talk about this a little bit in the lecture supplements, so I'd refer you to there. But there is a peripheral neurological disease that essentially paralyzes the facial musculature. And these individuals, there are two pictures of them. It was actually a married couple. They found each other with this condition. And they have very mask-like faces. They're perfectly pleasant faces, but you just can't get anything off those faces because they can't express anything on these faces because there's just a problem with the facial musculature. Sometimes in stroke patients, you will see this. Certain kinds of strokes, not the typical stroke. You'll see paralysis of, say, half the facial, one side of the body, and it'll go to one half of the face. So you've got somebody smiling with one side. I can't do this. Smiling with one side of the face, but nothing on the other side of the face. So yeah, there are all sorts of things that can happen. And if you spend enough time in a neurology clinic, you'll see these kinds of disorders from time to time. Botox. Botox screws up facial expressions of emotion. And the reason Botox does that is that Botox essentially paralyzes the facial musculature. What you're injecting, those of you who know anybody who does this silly thing, they're basically putting a curare derivative on the skin, right? Now, curare, that can't be a good thing, right? But what happens is that the muscles get paralyzed, and that impairs the person's ability to express various emotions on the face. So there are all sorts of wrinkles. One more, then I gotta go on. Well, I'm going to answer from Paul Ekman's point of view right now, because that's what I'm lecturing on, right? It's not learned, okay? It's automatic, it's innate, this is a reflex-like process, just like Gibson said it was. Gibson argued that the perceptual apparatus evolved in such a way as to extract the information from the stimulus that's necessary to tell us what the world is like, okay? And Ekman has very much the same position with respect to these things. Yeah, you can be taught the subtleties. If you couldn't be taught the subtleties, Ekman would run workshops in which he teaches the facial action coding system. But the basics, those half a dozen or so basic emotions and things like that, that's something that you're built with. Now, you raise an interesting question. We'll talk about this toward the end of the semester. Individuals with certain forms of autism spectrum disorder seem not to be able to read faces very well, okay? And for that matter, they seem not to express a lot of emotion on their faces. There may be a connection there. It could be a single mechanism, right, or two mechanisms that have been knocked out. And there are other people who are just bad at this, right? And for reasons we don't know, don't want to apply a diagnostic label or whatever. But some individuals with classic autism have difficulty recognizing faces, have difficulty paying attention to faces, have difficulty reading emotion off the face. And that seems to be a part of the core problem in that particular form of autism.